What if the very thing that makes you different was the same thing that got you rejected? What if someone looked you in the eye, after promising you affection, security, a future, and said, "You're too much"? This is the story of Ella, Lenina Morgan. And if you've ever been made to feel like you take up too much space, physically, emotionally, or just by being yourself, then this story is for you. Ella was tall, 6 feet tall. In today's world, that might earn a curious glance or maybe even admiration. But back in the late 1800s, for a woman, height like that wasn't seen as striking. It was seen as threatening, misfitting, almost unnatural. And that's exactly how the world made her feel. She grew up in Boston, a city brimming with tightly corseted expectations. There, a woman was praised for being small, soft-spoken, and willing to bend herself around the lives of others. Ella tried to shrink. She really did. She ducked through doorways, stooped during photographs. She let herself disappear in conversations, all because people told her again and again that she was too much, too tall, too strong, too visible. But inside her, something refused to stay small. She packed up her life, whatever was left of it, and boarded a westbound train to Silver Creek, Oregon, a rough logging town nestled between pine trees and fog, where people built homes with their hands and lives from scratch. She wasn't chasing grandeur. She was just chasing a place to belong, a place where maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to apologize for the space she took up. But Ella wasn't going in blind. For 6 months, she'd been exchanging letters with a man named William Prescott, a sawmill owner in Silver Creek. His handwriting was neat. His words, respectful. They didn't talk about grand dreams or passionate declarations. They talked about practical things. Weather, soup recipes, books. He seemed safe, steady. In a world that had felt so cruel, that felt like enough. There was one thing she never mentioned, her height. And he never asked. Maybe that was a mistake. Or maybe she just wanted to be seen first for her thoughts, not her silhouette. When her train screeched into Silver Creek, the air was icy and quiet. Ella stepped off the last car, a single suitcase in hand, boots crunching against the frozen ground. She smoothed the front of her forest green wool dress, handmade, well-worn, and waited. But no one waited for her. Until a man approached, sandy-haired, neat beard, polite smile, and noticeably shorter than her. William Prescott. She offered her gloved hand. "It's good to finally meet you." But the moment he looked up, really looked, his entire expression changed. His eyes flicked from her face to her boots, then back again. "You didn't mention your stature," he said, voice already uneasy. She kept her calm. "No, I didn't. You're taller than me," he stated as if it were a crime. "Yes," she said plainly. There was a long silence before he finally said, "I need a wife who fits the role." Ella blinked. "The role?" "A woman should look up to her husband," he muttered, "not the other way around." And right then, in front of a half-empty station and a few snickering men outside the saloon, he backed away. Said he'd arrange for her return passage, that she didn't belong there, that she wasn't what he'd expected. What he really meant was, she didn't make him feel big enough. Ella didn't cry. She didn't argue. She didn't beg for acceptance. Instead, she picked up her suitcase, the same one that suddenly felt heavier than ever, and walked off that platform alone. Let me ask you this. How many of us have had a William Prescott in our lives? Someone who pulled us in with warmth only to turn cold when they realized we weren't easy to handle? Someone who wanted us until we showed them the full picture? Ella's story didn't end there. In fact, that rejection was only the first chapter. Because sometimes being told you're too much is the very thing that forces you to find the people who know your worth. Ella walked into Silver Creek, not with a ring or a welcome, but with a quiet kind of courage. And soon, she would meet someone who didn't flinch at her height, who didn't want her to shrink, who saw her not as too much but as just enough. But that's part 2. For now, let's sit with this moment. With the cold platform, the heavy suitcase, the woman who wasn't chosen, not because she lacked value, but because the man in front of her couldn't rise to meet it, and maybe, just maybe, that rejection was the best thing that ever happened to her. Stay with this story, because sometimes the life you're meant for begins the moment someone else says no. Sometimes the smallest kindness can feel like a lifeline, especially when the world has just reminded you, loud and clear, that you're not what it expects. Ella Lenina Morgan had just been rejected, not quietly, not gently, but right there, on the cold platform of a strange town, dismissed for something she couldn't control. Her height. 6 feet tall, and for some reason, that made her unacceptable in the eyes of a man who'd promised her warmth. He left her with nothing but a heavy suitcase, muddy boots, and silence, and yet, life has a strange way of stepping in just when you think it's over. As she made her way off the platform, passing the leering stares and cruel chuckles from the saloon, Ella walked with her back straight. She'd spent years learning to hold herself tall, even when everything around her begged her to shrink. But that kind of strength, it's exhausting when you carry it alone. Then she heard a voice behind her, calm, deep, and warm in a way that cut through the cold. Quite a view. From up here, huh? Ella turned. A man stood nearby, arms folded, sleeves rolled to his elbows despite the chill. He had a thick beard, blue eyes that seemed to really see, and surprisingly he was taller than her. Not by much, but enough to make her blink. He smiled gently. Name's Gabriel Blackwood. I run the Northern Logging Camp. There's a boarding house in town. Martha Webb's place. Hot meals, clean beds. I can walk you there if you'd like. And just like that, something shifted. Not in a dramatic, romantic way, but in the quiet way hope sometimes returns. Ella hesitated. Of course, she did. After everything, why would a stranger offer help with no judgment, no catch? So she asked, "Why would you help me?" Gabriel didn't flinch. He just said, "Because no one deserves to be left stranded. And folks like you, the ones who don't fit the mold, they're the ones who change everything. Let that sink. And the ones who don't fit the mold, they're the ones who change everything." There's something incredibly powerful about being seen, not just noticed, but truly seen, especially after someone else has made you feel invisible. And in that moment, Gabriel wasn't trying to fix her. He wasn't offering pity, he was offering dignity, a simple gesture, a warm place to sleep, and most of all, a reminder that she was still worthy of kindness. Ella said yes. As they walked together through the muddy streets of Silver Creek, she noticed something. The stares didn't sting quite as much. The whispers didn't cut as deep. There's a certain magic in walking beside someone who doesn't need you to be smaller for their comfort. Maybe you've experienced that before. Someone who, by simply standing next to you, made you feel more whole. Someone who didn't make you feel like too much, but just enough. When they reached Martha Webb's boarding house, the warmth of the place felt like more than just firelight. It felt like the start of something. Not a love story, at least. Not yet. But a shift. A new page. And for Ella, it was the first time in a long while that she didn't feel completely alone. Gabriel didn't stay. He had a camp to run, men to manage, timber to move, but his presence lingered, like a note held at the end of a song, soft, steady, and full of something unspoken. It's easy to think strength means going it alone, powering through, not needing anyone. But sometimes real strength is knowing when to accept an outstretched hand, when to let someone walk beside you, not to carry your weight, but to remind you that you don't have to carry it all alone. So yes, Ella's journey began in rejection, but now a door had opened. A new town, a new rhythm, and, whether she realized it or not, a new ally. And maybe that's the lesson here. Sometimes the people who truly matter arrive not with grand gestures, but with simple offers. A walk, a warm place, a kind word. Not to save you, but to remind you that you were never broken to begin with. Sometimes starting over doesn't look like a grand adventure. Sometimes it's just a quiet room, a spool of thread, and the steady hum of a sewing needle pulling its way through the past. After being left on a train platform by the man who once promised her a future, Ella Lenina Morgan didn't fall apart. She didn't shout. She didn't cry where anyone could see. Instead, she carried her suitcase, heavier now with disappointment, and walked into town like a woman with something still to prove. Maybe not to the world, but to herself. That night, she slept under the roof of Martha Webb, a woman with kind eyes, sharp instincts, and a no-nonsense warmth that only years of hard living can teach you. Martha saw what the others didn't. She didn't flinch at Ella's height, didn't whisper about the rumors. She simply said, "My husband was tall, as a pine tree, raised every doorway in this place so he didn't have to duck. You don't need to stoop here either." It was the first time in a long time Ella had permission to stand tall, literally and figuratively, but kindness alone doesn't pay for room and board. Ella had to earn her keep, and what she had wasn't land or money or protection. What she had were her hands, trained, precise, unshakable. Years of stitching hems and patching sleeves back in Boston had left her with a talent many overlooked. So she asked for a space to work, and Martha, without hesitation, gave her the little room off the back porch, dusty, forgotten, but full of sunlight. "It used to be my sewing space," she said. "It's yours now, just don't waste the light." And so, Ella began again, not with fanfare, but with fabric. She unpacked bolts of wool and cotton she'd brought from the city, laid out her needles, replaced silence with the soft rhythm of thread moving through cloth. Her hands, steady and familiar, moved like memory. Words spread faster than she expected. One woman came with a dress that needed letting out, another with a torn apron. Then came the pastor's wife with curtains for the schoolhouse. By noon, that day, Ella had a waiting list. By the end of the week, she had a reputation, the giant seamstress with the golden hands. And while the name might have been whispered with a smirk at the saloon, Ella didn't mind. Let them whisper. She finally had something of her own. Then one afternoon, Gabriel Blackwood showed up again. He stood in the doorway of her sewing room, tall, quiet, like a tree with something to say. He removed his hat, nodded respectfully, and asked, "Still in town?" "I am," Ella said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Good," he replied with a pause. "I've got an offer. Turns out loggers aren't gentle on their clothes. Shirts split at the seams, coats torn from hauling timber, gloves worn through before winter's end. And up at his northern camp, there wasn't a soul who could stitch a straight line." "We could use someone with your skills," Gabriel said. "I can offer steady work, fair pay. Doesn't have to be fancy. Just strong enough to last through rough hands." Ella blinked. No one had ever offered her something with both dignity and practicality before. "Not like this." "You're offering me work?" she asked, still surprised. "I'm offering you business," he corrected. "You've got talent, I've got ripped shirts, it just makes sense." There was no flattery in his voice, no condescension, just clarity. "Respect." She smiled. "Then, we have a deal." Before leaving, Gabriel hesitated just for a second and added, "There's a church social this Saturday. The whole town will be there. Might be a good place to meet more folks, maybe take some orders." "Are you going?" she asked. "Not usually my scene," he said, shrugging. "But maybe this time." And then he was gone again, like a gust through the pines, quiet, grounded, unforgettable. Ella turned back to her work, but something had changed. A new thread had been woven into her day. A partnership, maybe. A new beginning, definitely. What strikes me most about this chapter in Ella's story isn't the romance or the small-town drama. It's the resilience. Because starting over is hard. It's unglamorous. It's vulnerable. But Ella didn't wait for the world to hand her dignity. She stitched it together piece by piece until it wrapped around her like armor. And maybe that's a reminder for the rest of us. We don't need a grand comeback. Sometimes, We just need a needle, a quiet room, and the courage to begin again. There's something quietly radical about showing up exactly as you are, in a world that spent its energy telling you not to. That's what Ella Lenina Morgan did the night of the church social. Let's set the scene. The town of Silver Creek was buzzing. Long tables were already heavy with pies, roast chicken, and pitchers of cider. Fiddle music drifted through the air, kids darted between benches, and the air, though winter cold, felt warm with anticipation. This wasn't just a party. In small towns like this, socials were where reputations were shaped, where new folks were evaluated, and old tensions quietly tested. And for Ella, who still bore the fresh memory of being publicly rejected on a train platform, walking into that room wasn't just brave, it was defiant. She stood in front of the mirror that evening in a dress she'd sewn herself. Deep burgundy wool, embroidered at the collar in copper thread. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't meant to be, but it fit her. It didn't apologize for her shape or try to hide her height. No corset, no shrinking. Just a tall woman in a good dress, shoulders back, eyes forward, and when she walked into the church hall, the room quieted, just a little, not because of scandal, but because presence like that, it draws attention. Some stared, some whispered, some looked away. But Ella didn't. Wilt. She was used to being looked at. The difference was, this time she wasn't ashamed of being seen. She found herself surrounded by Martha Webb, who introduced her to the townsfolk with that confident, no room for nonsense smile. Ella shook hands with the doctor, the school teacher, the widow who ran the post office. People asked about her sewing, admired her work, even offered thanks for the curtains she'd fixed at the schoolhouse. And then, as the fiddles picked up and laughter spread, someone else walked in. Gabriel Blackwood. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in pressed trousers and a clean white shirt that still looked a little out of place on him, like the forest itself had put on its Sunday best. But his eyes, they found her instantly. He crossed the room in slow, steady steps. A few nodded to him. No one stopped him. "Miss Morgan," he said softly, "you look well." "As do you," she replied, feeling a tremor in her voice she hadn't expected. They stood close, not touching, not yet. But the air between them shifted, like gravity bending toward something new. And then he asked her to dance. She hesitated. "It's been a while," she admitted. "Then we'll be rusty together," he said. She took his hand and it fit. They moved slow at first, uncertain, but their rhythm found itself. For once she didn't have to look down. Their eyes met, level and even. His hand at her back wasn't guiding her, it was walking with her. There's something rare in that. Too many women know the feeling of being danced around instead of with, of having to make themselves smaller so the other person can lead. But not this time. Not with Gabriel. As they turned gently on the wooden floor, Ella felt something she hadn't in a long time. Balance, safety, and maybe, just maybe, beginning. Then, of course, came the interruption. William Prescott, the man who'd once promised her everything through neat letters and broke it all in a single glance. He stood near the back, arms crossed, a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, watching, waiting. Eventually he walked over, all smug diplomacy and false civility. "Miss Morgan," he said with a nod. "Mr. Blackwood, didn't expect to see either of you tonight." Gabriel didn't blink. "We're here like everyone else." William offered a fake chuckle. "Of course, though some might say the sight of certain pairs tends to stir tongues." Ella tilted her head, calm, direct. "Let them talk," she said. "I've been talked about my whole life. It doesn't change who I am." William's smile tightened. "Silver Creek has traditions." "Then maybe it's time those traditions caught up," she replied. And when he tried to deliver one last jab, "Do your feet even fit on the dance floor?" Ella didn't flinch. She looked him square in the eye and said, I'd rather have feet too big for the floor than a heart too small for the truth. He left, red-faced. Gabriel exhaled beside her. You handled that better than I would have. She turned to him. You give me courage. He smiled. Small, real. You already had it. I just reminded you it was there. And there it was. Not a love story, not yet. But the spark of one. The kind built on mutual respect, not rescue. On steady hands and honest glances. The kind that doesn't ask you to shrink. Sometimes the true shape of a person doesn't reveal itself in comfort, but in crisis. And when the snow came down hard on Silver Creek, so did everything Ella Lenina Morgan had carefully started to build. It began with a whisper through town. Word, from the logging camp up north. There'd been an accident, a tree slide, a horse spooked, a man crushed. The name came quietly at first. Gabriel Blackwood. They said he'd gotten his men to safety, but hadn't made it out himself. That the ridge had turned slick, the pine trunks too fast, too heavy. That his body had been found bruised, broken, but breathing. When the knock came, at Martha Webb's boarding house, a young logger soaked to the bone, Ella didn't ask questions. She grabbed her coat, her scarf, and ran. There was no time for fear, no time for what-ifs or appearances. Only one thought pulsed in her chest like a drum. He needs me. At the doctor's house, the air was thick with pine sap, sweat, and the sterile burn of antiseptic. 4 loggers sat silent by the hearth, their eyes hollow, and then someone said, "He's asking for you." Ella walked into that back room and found Gabriel on a cot, barely big enough for his frame. His leg was splinted, wrapped in wool, his torso tightly bandaged, a gash above his brow still seeping red into the linen. But his eyes, they were still his, steady, fierce, alive. "You came," he whispered, with that faint, gruff humor that didn't quite mask the pain. "Of course I did," she replied, sitting by his side. "Don't try to talk your way out of this one." And that was it. No declarations, no dramatics, just her hand finding his, quiet, solid, present. And then, over the next days, she kept coming back, every morning, like clockwork. Some days with fresh bread, some with nothing but herself. She mended shirts at his bedside while he dozed, read aloud from books she'd brought from Boston, held water to his lips, brushed the hair from his brow when the fever threatened to rise. Outside that house, the world whispered. Loudly. What was she doing there? Every day? A single woman? Was it charity? Or something else? You see, towns like Silver Creek have a memory like winter, slow to thaw. And while Ella was gaining quiet respect for her sewing, for her strength, she was still an outsider. Still, that tall woman. Still the one who had been left behind. So now, people talked. And William Prescott. He made sure of it. Every time he saw her in town, he offered a smug smile, the kind that says, "I told you this would happen." Once, passing her on the boardwalk, he tipped his hat and said, "Some folks just can't help but make a spectacle of themselves." She didn't respond. Didn't need to. Because here's the thing about love. Not the dramatic sweeping kind, but the quiet kind. The real kind. It doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't fit into polite boxes or wait for approval from people who never truly saw you to begin with. It just shows up. Every single day. And Ella? She showed up. Not for attention, not for validation, but because someone she cared about was hurting, and leaving wasn't an option. What she didn't expect was how much the world around her would resist that. Sometimes we think the hardest part of love is loss, but often it's standing beside someone in the middle of uncertainty, when the world is watching, waiting for you to fail or walk away. But Ella didn't flinch. She stayed. And as Gabriel slowly began to heal, fever down, breath steady, pain dulling, so did something else. Something between them that hadn't needed to be said. Mary Simmons, the nurse, saw it first. She'd once been Gabriel's fiancée, back in a life that had cracked and shifted with time. And now she watched from the doorway, quiet, composed, but knowing. She didn't say a word. But she didn't have to. Because when Ella reached for Gabriel's hand and he held it like it was the one thing anchoring him to this world, something changed. The rumors would get louder, the stares would sharpen, but so would Ella's spine. Because she wasn't just the tall girl from Boston anymore. She was the woman who stayed when it mattered most. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with fists or weapons, but with words spoken in rooms that were never built to include you. And on a bitter Thursday morning in Silver Creek, Ella Lenina Morgan stood up in one of those rooms and changed everything. Let's back up. The Northern Railroad Commission had come to town with plans to run a new line straight through the ancient pines that framed Silver Creek's North Ridge. It was quick money, fast progress, and to some, especially William Prescott, it looked like opportunity. He painted the picture perfectly. Charts, maps, polished shoes, a man who knew how to win a room. But what the plan didn't show was what it would destroy. Gabriel Blackwood knew it. He'd walked those woods for years, run his logging camp with balance, not greed. He understood the land, its rhythms, its risks, its value beyond profit. So even with his ribs still healing and a crutch under one arm, Gabriel showed up to that meeting, not because he wanted a fight, but because he couldn't stay silent while something sacred was about to be sold off for short-term gain. The town hall was packed, shoulder to shoulder, half of them skeptical, half of them just curious. And a few, too few, ready to listen. Gabriel spoke first. His voice was steady but raw. He told them about the land, the trees, the damage they couldn't undo. He reminded them that once something ancient is gone, it doesn't come back. But it wasn't enough. Not against William's polish. Not against the pressure of progress. And that's when Ella stood up. No one asked her to. No one expected her to. She wasn't on the council. She wasn't even from Silver Creek, but she had something that couldn't be ignored. Truth, presence, and nothing left to prove. She stood taller than anyone in that room, and not just because of her height. She said, "I came here a stranger. I was rejected before I even unpacked my suitcase, but I stayed. Because something told me this town still had room for something real." Then she paused, looked across the room at William Prescott, and without raising her voice, she continued. "This isn't about railroad lines. This is about who we are when money knocks on the door. It's about whether we sell our future for someone else's profit. And it's about whether we value the people who've bled for this land, or just the ones who dress better while selling." It off. The room shifted. Murmurs, a few nods. And she ended with this. "You can build a town on progress, yes, but if you do it without integrity, without memory, without roots, you're not building a town. You're just building something that looks like one until the wind comes." You could have heard a pin drop. Then William stood up. Calm, calculated. He said, "Let us not forget that the voices opposing this project do not represent Silver Creek's traditions. They're outsiders." And that's when Gabriel leaned forward and said, "You're right. I'm not from here. I chose to be here. I stayed through 10 winters, 10 summers. I've buried friends in that ground. I've bled for this ridge. Can you say the same, William?" The room erupted, not in chaos but in clarity. The vote came quickly, 3-2. Proposal denied. The North Ridge would stand. The forest would remain, but more than land was protected that day. Something shifted in the soul of that town. They saw Ella not just as the tall seamstress, not just as Gabriel's shadow, but as someone who'd risked her comfort, her reputation, to stand up for something bigger than herself. It wasn't a victory for just one person. It was a collective reminder that change doesn't always come in storms. Sometimes it walks in quietly, speaks calmly, and tells the truth even when it's inconvenient. You might wonder, what gave her the right to speak? She was new. She was different. She wasn't one of them. But maybe that's exactly why it mattered. Because when someone without power dares to speak and the room still listens, that's how you know the truth is bigger than tradition. And that, more than anything, is how new futures begin. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with fists or weapons, but with words spoken in rooms that were never built to include you. And on a bitter Thursday morning in Silver Creek, Ella Lenina Morgan stood up in one of those rooms and changed everything. Let's back up. The Northern Railroad Commission had come to town with plans to run a new line straight through the ancient pines that framed Silver Creek's North Ridge. It was quick money, fast progress, and to some, especially William Prescott, it looked like opportunity. He painted the picture perfectly. Charts, maps, polished shoes, a man who knew how to win a room. But what the plan didn't show was what it would destroy. Gabriel Blackwood knew it. He'd walked those woods for years, run his logging camp with balance, not greed. He understood the land, its rhythms, its risks, its value beyond profit. So even with his ribs still healing and a crutch under one arm, Gabriel showed up to that meeting, not because he wanted a fight, but because he couldn't stay silent while something sacred was about to be sold off for short-term gain. The town hall was packed, shoulder to shoulder, half of them skeptical, half of them just curious. And a few, too few, ready to listen. Gabriel spoke first. His voice was steady but raw. He told them about the land, the trees, the damage they couldn't undo. He reminded them that once something ancient is gone, it doesn't come back. But it wasn't enough. Not against William's polish. Not against the pressure of progress. And that's when Ella stood up. No one asked her to. No one expected her to. She wasn't on the council. She wasn't even from Silver Creek, but she had something that couldn't be ignored. Truth, presence, and nothing left to prove. She stood taller than anyone in that room, and not just because of her height. She said, "I came here a stranger. I was rejected before I even unpacked my suitcase, but I stayed. Because something told me this town still had room for something real." Then she paused, looked across the room at William Prescott, and without raising her voice, she continued. "This isn't about railroad lines. This is about who we are when money knocks on the door. It's about whether we sell our future for someone else's profit. And it's about whether we value the people who've bled for this land, or just the ones who dress better while selling." It off. The room shifted. Murmurs, a few nods. And she ended with this. "You can build a town on progress, yes, but if you do it without integrity, without memory, without roots, you're not building a town. You're just building something that looks like one until the wind comes." You could have heard a pin drop. Then William stood up. Calm, calculated. He said, "Let us not forget that the voices opposing this project do not represent Silver Creek's traditions. They're outsiders." And that's when Gabriel leaned forward and said, "You're right. I'm not from here. I chose to be here. I stayed through 10 winters, 10 summers. I've buried friends in that ground. I've bled for this ridge. Can you say the same, William?" The room erupted, not in chaos but in clarity. The vote came quickly, 3-2. Proposal denied. The North Ridge would stand. The forest would remain, but more than land was protected that day. Something shifted in the soul of that town. They saw Ella not just as the tall seamstress, not just as Gabriel's shadow, but as someone who'd risked her comfort, her reputation, to stand up for something bigger than herself. It wasn't a victory for just one person. It was a collective reminder that change doesn't always come in storms. Sometimes it walks in quietly, speaks calmly, and tells the truth even when it's inconvenient. You might wonder, what gave her the right to speak? She was new. She was different. She wasn't one of them. But maybe that's exactly why it mattered. Because when someone without power dares to speak and the room still listens, that's how you know the truth is bigger than tradition. And that, more than anything, is how new futures begin.